Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. A little more than a decade ago, I was a 19-year-old student at a small Midwest college. I was still taking my general courses and happened to have an evening psychology course with 40 to 50 fellow students. We broke into small groups to discuss readings and assignments on a regular basis. That's where I met a fellow student named James. There was nothing creepy about James, and we were no more than casual classroom acquaintances. This comes into play later on. I have a relative who was a Catholic priest, and we would travel to his home on the Easter holiday to celebrate with him, and sometimes guests of his inviting. One particular Easter, he invited a colleague of his. The colleague was also planning on becoming a priest and was learning from the particular church he was assigned to. He came off as a mostly quiet, focused man, nothing out of the norm for someone who was a third wheel at a family dinner. The day wore on, and there were card games and drinks. It wasn't a secret that this man enjoyed having a beer or two. I found it a little odd that he was drinking heavily, but then again, so were others. I remember leaving the get-together and shaking hands with him, an awkward interaction at best, and that was what I thought would be the last I would hear about him. Flash forward a few months, and there is news of a murder in a funeral home not far from the small Midwest college I attended. The murder went unsolved for quite some time. The part that hits home with this murder, James was the victim, the same James the first had psychology class with. He was interning to be a mortician and was shot at the funeral home of his internship. A number of months later, I saw news reports and read articles on a big break in the case. The same priest I had met at Easter dinner had been assigned to a new parish. The new parish had mixed feelings about his demeanor, and there were allegations of improper conduct with children in the community. Apparently, the director of the funeral home was about to confront the priest with the allegations. Knowing this, the priest went to the funeral home and murdered the director, along with James. Not only did I shake the murderer's hand, but I had also known one of the victims. It still chills me to the bone to this day. I was about 15 and had experienced strange men following and talking to me and many of my friends, so I knew how to act around them and avoid them. It's important to know that I live in a neighborhood where there is quite a bit of violence, drug use, rape gangs, and occasionally a few shootings. It was a nice, sunny Saturday afternoon, and I had decided to take my dog for a walk around the block. The park behind my house joins the next street over to mine. It's like a big loop, so to get home, you walk through the park. My street and the one next to it are also dead ends, and there are never any people around. It's very peaceful, but can get creepy at times. I used to walk past a man who kept a giant knife in his sock on my way home from school, and there have been a few times when the cops were called around nighttime because of strange people in the park doing bad things. But during the day, it's pretty safe and quite beautiful. As I reached the beginning of the park, I saw a priest sitting on one of the park benches, looking at the trees. I didn't think much of him because, surprisingly, we do have two Greek churches in our neighborhood. He was an older man, maybe around 60 to 65 years old, so if he was going to make a move, I didn't think he could do much. I walked past him with my dog, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw his head turn to look at me. I brushed it off because, after all, I was the only other person in the park. But after I took about 5 more steps, I heard leaves crunching behind me. I looked back only to see that the priest had gotten up and was slowly heading in my direction. At this point, I was a bit anxious, and he was starting to creep me out a bit, but I pushed my thoughts aside and told myself I was overthinking. I kept walking through the park with about 250 meters left to my house. The park is very open, with only a few trees spread apart, so it's easy to see everything and everyone. As I walked home, I kept looking behind me to see where the priest was. He was still following me, and his steps were in sync with mine. At this point, I was creeped out, but I didn't want to run, just in case he started running. I just acted casual, but kept a close eye on what he was doing. I was nearly at the end of the park and about to turn onto my street. I decided to look back at the priest one more time. This time, when I looked, he stopped walking and smiled at me, but not a normal smile. It was a big, creepy smile that gave me chills. My dog even noticed what was happening and began barking at the priest. My dog barks at a lot of people, so this was normal, but it snapped me back to reality, and I decided to bolt back to my house. As soon as I began running, the priest picked up his pace and started chasing after me. He got up pretty quick for a guy his age, which actually impressed me for a second. He got close enough to reach his arm out and attempt to grab the hood of my jacket. At that point, I screamed and was about to cry. I made it home, and luckily, the door was unlocked. I got inside with the dog, panting. I never told anyone what happened, but I continued to watch the priest from my kitchen window. He stood outside my home for a bit, trying to look in, but then he turned around and started heading back to the park. He looked as though he was mumbling something to himself. When I was 25, my grandmother passed away, so I went with my mom and dad to the small town where she had been living and where my parents had grown up, for the funeral. My grandparents had been very Catholic, so there were 6 kids and a lot of cousins all converging on the area, most of us staying in the house where the majority of them grew up. On the day of the wake, we all went to the funeral home. My grandmother had a lot of friends, and many people showed up to pay their respects. My mother's siblings and many of their kids, along with my parents and me, all ended up in the horribly unpleasant phenomenon known as the receiving line, where everyone offers platitudes and you are supposed to feel comforted or something. I was standing very near the open casket, between my mother and father, shaking hands with strangers and hearing variations of "I'm sorry for your loss" over and over. When this elderly priest approached, he skipped my father, who was never Catholic, completely and took my hands in his. He then went on at length about what a beautiful daughter my parents had while alternately staring into my eyes and then at my chest. This was in a funeral home next to my dead grandmother, and he was a priest. After about a minute of this, he shook my mother's hand and eventually remembered why he was there and said some clichés to my mother. I said, just loud enough for my parents to hear, "Did that actually just happen?" because I honestly could not believe it. Apparently, it had. It's still the baseline in my family for the most awkward situation imaginable. My family is quite religious, and up until I turned 18, they insisted on taking me to our local temple every Sunday. Since then, I go very irregularly, but over a period of a couple of months, 2 years ago, when I was 23, I was going every week due to various family functions. Since it is a small temple, I've always known the people who are always there, from the kitchen helpers to the priests. There's never really anyone new, so it was quite interesting when a new priest, a man in his late 50s, joined the congregation, having come over from India. My grandfather, also a priest in a local temple, had personally helped him obtain a visa, having known him from his younger years in India. When my great-uncle died a few months after he arrived, he even took the lead at his funeral. He quickly became popular with everyone. He was constantly talking to people, seemed like a nice man, and was always smiling, laughing, and telling jokes. One day, my mum pointed out to me that he was very touchy-feely with the kids, like he was always tickling them and picking them up, even the kids who were too old to be picked up. I found it odd how often he took the opportunity to do so. I come from a big family with countless cousins, 2 of whom were sisters and were 5 and 7 at the time. I noticed they were often in his presence. Their parents were quite happy for them to run around the temple and do as they wished, which, growing up, my parents had forbidden me from doing. I personally felt that running around and being out of sight of your parents at such a young age wasn't right, but I had no say in what they were and weren't allowed to do. One Sunday, both my cousins came downstairs. The older one was crying hysterically, which was out of character for her. Her parents were trying to find out what had happened, but she wouldn't stop crying. I managed to find the younger one and asked her what had happened. She said she didn't know, but had seen her sister come out of the priest's room, where he lived in the temple and had a bedroom upstairs, crying, so she brought her downstairs immediately. This set off alarm bells. I told my mom, and she spoke to my cousin's family about it. Coming from an Asian family, there is a lot of honor-based pressure in the culture. From that point on, her family went quiet. They stopped coming around to our house and disappeared from the temple on Sundays, while the priest was still in his job. My mom and I were both at a loss about what to do. Without speaking to my cousin about what happened, we could do nothing. Throwing around accusations without evidence is an extremely dangerous game. About 3 weeks after the incident, with nothing having been done or said, we decided to visit her at her family's house. My mom rang ahead and said she wanted to talk about what had happened with the family and my cousin. This turned out to be a mistake. When we got there, it was clear they had told my cousin to lie. My mom and I took her upstairs to talk in a quiet room and asked what had happened. She told us that he had invited her into his room to play and had pulled a scary face, which had scared her and made her upset. We tried telling her it was okay to tell us everything without putting any words in her mouth, but she stuck to that story. We were convinced her family had coached her not to say anything. There wasn't a thing we could do, and we toyed with the idea that maybe that was the truth and maybe we were just being overly paranoid. That mindset went out the window when news broke that another girl's family had put in a complaint about inappropriate behavior. Around 2 months later, he was beaten up and hounded out of the country. He moved back to India, and my grandfather made sure to alert all the local temples in the area about him. It burns that that scumbag spoke at my great-uncle's funeral and that he did something to my cousin. I don't know what he did, but I hope it wasn't something that she will struggle with for the rest of her life. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.